Welcome back to the show, everybody. Today's guest is Geoff Woo. Geoff is an entrepreneur and investor, and he thinks about compounding technology, systems, and organizations, studied computer science, information theory, and distributed systems at Stanford University, and graduated with honors and distinction. He is interested in the science of human performance and nutrition and founded HVMN, Health Via Modern Nutrition. Extending longevity while improving day-to-day performance is the ultimate personal compounder. To change and master our environment, let's start with changing and mastering ourselves. All right, this is off of Geoff Woo's bio on his website, and it's absolutely fantastic, but it doesn't tell you much about Geoff. I mean, quick background. I like getting into the background of everybody on the show. And after having Michael Brandt on, the other co-founder of HVMN, one of my favorite companies in the world, learned a little bit about Geoff through Michael, and then got to meet Geoff about a year ago, close to a year ago, I guess, or maybe a few months ago. And I podcasted with Michael a year ago. Geoff figured it out on the podcast, and it was fucking longer than we thought it was. So anywho, it's been a long time coming. I'm very impressed with both Geoff and Michael's backgrounds at Stanford, down the street from where I grew up, and very impressed with what they're doing right now. They have one of the greatest supplement companies on the planet, HVMN, which has a $6 million contract with the Department of Defense, U.S. Special Operations Command. They're fucking doing it, and they're doing it with the best of the best in the entire world. They're working with some of the best doctors that I've had on this podcast, like Dr. Dominic D'Agostino, and many others that are deep into the field of ketogenic diets and how ketosis can be used under all sorts of different combat situations and circumstances. And one of the things that Dr. Dominic or Dom points out is that for some reason, the ketogenic diet attenuates a lack of sleep. And that's really fucking cool, that it actually can help mitigate lost sleep if you're getting up, in the middle of the night on a fire truck, if you're working late night on the beat as a cop, whatever the thing is, if you're doing something that is incredibly taxing in the middle of the night, this could be an answer to that. This could be a very good answer for being able to have energy when you need it and not feeling like shit the next day when you got to get up on 3 or 4 hours of sleep. So we dive into a lot of the science, the new stuff that's just coming to the surface right now, where ketones are headed, where they've been, and really Geoff's background, because he's a fascinating dude, and I love what these guys are doing. Check them out at hvmn.com/KKP and use promo code KKP at checkout for 20% off. And without further ado, my brother, Geoff Woo. All right, y'all, we're at the farm. Geoff Woo's in the house. Co-founder of HVMN. We had Michael Brandt on, I think 2 or 3 months ago.
Apparently the team checked. It was like a year ago.
No shit.
So it's been a long time. And we hung up, I think, in person 2-3 months ago. Last time I was out in Austin. Hit a little work at the Onnit gym.
And that was 2 or 3 months ago.
Yeah.
See, shit flies.
Yeah, time's flying when you're having fun. But like you were telling me about this property, and now we finally got the tour.
Yeah,
it's amazing. I mean, I think you're talking about how all the energy healers and we're reading the land, and it's just like, I don't have any of that skill set, but I think you're just out here. You're like, wow, there's a lot of thought, tender love, and care put in the land. It's cool. Like this is going to be an awesome success. It's going to be a
hell yeah, brother.
Everyone's got to check it out.
And that's the thing. Like you can talk about it. It's another thing where there's a visceral feeling here, and you don't have to be a light worker or whatever the fuck you want to call yourself. You don't have to have any of these credentials. When you come here, if it's palpable and you can feel it, like you go to Sedona and you're like, oh, something's different here. I don't know much about vortexes, but there's a different feel to the land when I'm there, right? Yeah. And that's what we're trying to cultivate here. So super happy I could bring you out here and give you guys the tour. Michael had a blast going on the tour last time, and he didn't get to see it where it is now. Like every year it just gets better and better. So that's really cool.
I mean, I think friends like yourself, I feel like really opened me up towards spirituality and something that is like not scientific. I just grew up not religious. My parents came from communist China, so it was like not really religion in our family.
Talk about that, actually, because I've read different things. People read all sorts of shit about, social credit and all that, and that's a separate story. But from a spirituality standpoint, I've heard that there's some mix of Christianity, Taoism, and Confucianism in China, or some play on one of the three. Is that it? Or is it mostly now just modern fucking world and all that shit's on the back burner?
I mean, I think what is like technically classified as traditional Chinese folk religion, right? Like there's like these mythology stories, like these equivalent to saints, these like historical characters that are kind of mythological. And I think there's like a couple like dominant philosophical schools like Confucianism, which is like very, respecting ancestors, like a very strict hierarchy, the emperor, the father, the mother. So I think a lot of these philosophical contracts have emerged into, I would say, like Chinese American culture where like people very value much education and, being with their family, taking care of their grandparents. So I think some of the positive
home, yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I think some of those positive attributes come from some of these like philosophical schools. And I think you have but I think there's not like, probably like not like a very strict traditional like top-down religious constructs within, I think, my understanding of Chinese civilization.
You're not born into it at this stage of where
and
China's
especially
at,
when the communist revolution happened, or it was just like, the communists took over and like there was like a cultural revolution like reset. So all the traditional things were thrown out, like the educated people were thrown out. They were like, marched around with cone heads. My grandparents were like principals and educators. So I think they were kind of caught in that purge a little bit. But it sounded like there were some students in the Red Army that like looked up to them, so like they didn't get super hazed. But I remember like just growing up, my mom telling me stories when she was like 15. Everyone got kicked out of school, and they all got sent down to the farmland to learn how to be a proletariat farmer and like reset culture. So all the religion, obviously, like the communist ethos is no religion. We're gonna all just be this commune essentially.
Yeah.
So that's kind of my backdrop.
Yeah, I'm fascinated by it. I remember, was it Yeonmi Park?
Yep.
Went on from North Korea, went on Rogan's, and that was a brilliant. I'll link to that in the show notes if you haven't heard it. It's a must listen. It's not something I don't think people in America really wrap their heads around. You only really hear old farts talking about it. You know, like the Cold War or Cuban Missile Crisis or any of these different things where you're like, why are we so worried about communism? Like, and it was just like there was a disconnect from my generation to what other people lived with and experienced as a true fear.
Yeah.
And then now, oddly enough, you see, some like the Great Reset and some of these ideologies come through that actually partner and pair really well with communism, socialism, those kind of things. Yep. And it's kind of like, oh, okay, I can see. There's like almost like I don't know if it's never ending, but there's a consistent, backdrop into trying to play with different models of humanity, right? And what is that ideology? It could be from Marxist ideology or from different things, but like it is a part of the ecosystem of how humans think and what we think would be the best possible way to govern and work with this many people on the planet.
I mean, I think it comes from like a good heart, right? Like, I don't think people are like, hey, I'm going to be an evil dictator. But it's like, okay, like we want to have everyone being equal, and we're going to like have some smart, generous people figure out how to allocate resources amongst the people. And it's like, it's never worked in practice. And I think I'm almost resigned to the fact that, like to your point, I think these are just repeating cycles where every generation needs to learn its own mistakes. Like, hey, we think that communism wasn't implemented correctly. They can do it again now and we'll do it better. And it's like, I think that is going to be, and I think that happened with World War I, right? Like this is going to be the last war because so many freaking people died, and it's like the most brutal war. 17 million people died. We're never going to have a war again. Fast forward another, 30 years later, World War II, and then there's always been like, every decade's been a massive conflict.
Yeah. Have you read The Fourth Turning or heard about it? Oh God, you fucking love that one. Yeah. They talk about 80-year cycles, with 4 20-year seasons.
Yep.
And the season is the high, that's like the spring. The awakening is the summer. The unraveling is the fall, and then the crisis period is the winter, right? And so they wrote this in the mid-90s and predicted that the next crisis period would start in 2005, give or take 2 or 3 years. Yeah. 2007 hits, 2008, boom, we're right in it. And they've marked, any great civilization, they can map it. So we've gone, this is our 4th big turning. So it started off with America in the Revolutionary War, crisis period, then Civil War, then World War II. And we're in the crisis period now, that was marked with the 2008 housing crisis, COVID, and we're still in it for like 2028, 2030.
Yeah.
So it's kind of like everything's been marked by big war. You look at World War II and the Great Depression, you look at the Civil War, which is more American lives lost than any other war, all of the wars combined, and the Revolutionary War, which kicked things off. And it's like, I don't live in fear, but there's also like a very strong presence to say this shit could pop off, in the next 8 years in a way that most people aren't prepared for.
This, like, is it egocentric because like, hey, we think that we're alive today, we're in the most interesting time in history, and is it egocentric, or is it actually objectively like very, very rapid in terms of development, right? Like from COVID pandemic to banking crisis to, potentially, already a war in Ukraine and Russia, and then just rising tensions with China. I think it is, objectively like a very interesting, volatile time period. But I don't know, I'm self-conscious of the fact that maybe we are just like, hey, we're egocentric. We're living in the most exciting time in history. I don't know. Like we'll see, like AI is happening. Like maybe, DOD is saying that maybe there might be aliens out there. So, I mean, going back to the point, I feel like spending time with like folks like you, like, and just building like friendships, I feel like I've been much more open. So I grew up, like, I think just very academically oriented, very scientifically oriented. If it didn't have a randomized controlled trial, it was bullshit. But I think I just realized that we are very malleable, living, emotional creatures. And even like the sense of energy when you're in vivo with like great people in like a room when everyone's doing breath work, or there's like a awesome music festival and like there's energy. There is something there that I don't know how to best quantify in terms of like scientific metric.
Yeah.
But I think as emotional humans that respond to energy and is seeing, friends achieve a lot of things through manifestation, we're talking about a little bit about this, I've just become much more open-minded and wanting to be spiritual and tap into that in this notion of faith, because the scientific part of my mind says, hey, even if it's a placebo effect, I will take that freaking free placebo because the placebo effect works.
Yeah.
But I think having that kind of sense of, hey, there is a bigger story, a universal story that we're tapping into, I think that kind of release of sovereignty to something bigger, I think is a comforting notion. I think if we're all just like, hey, we have 80 years, you're by yourself, you got to figure it out, and that's on your mind every single day, I think that is like a very daunting task to be able to have to hold through your lifetime. So having that, I think that yin and yang of pulling and pushing between having agency, being rational, being pragmatic, and then having some sort of spiritual grounding and like tapping into the emotion and the energy of good people. I think part of, wanting to spend more time with you is just tapping more in that school, more of that culture. And I think that in some ways, I think you seem very happy. And I think a lot of people in business or just super techie are just not super happy people. And like, what is winning?
Yeah.
If it's like, hey, you want to like kind of maximize the integral of happiness and like a sense of achievement through your lifetime of, the 80, 90 years that we hopefully get to live.
What is that metric? Some of the interesting studies that I've loved are people in their deathbed, or they interview all these people in their deathbed and they ask them, what if you could change, 5 things about your life, what would it be?
Yeah.
And then almost universally, they all have a very, very, maybe there's 6 of them, right? But they're all saying, I wish I spent more time with friends. I wish I spent more time with family. I wish I had invested more in relationships rather than my work. Like there's a pretty common thread that's told at the end of life with a lot of people. And I think, all of us to some degree were brought up, whether, our grandparents came here or it was great-great-granddad or whatever the fuck that is, that like, here's the land of opportunity. Make yourself what you're going to make for yourself. But that takes hard work. And people get caught into, and I don't know if it's salvationist theory through Christian ideology or something else, but it's like, I'll be happy when is an okay thing to live with, right? If I bust my ass now, when I retire, I'll get to do what I want then. I'll be happy when I have X, Y, and Z. I'll be happy when I have X amount of money and I've got a white picket fence or whatever the fucking thing I was told to get. And most people more and more waking up to the fact that they're like, no, I don't think that's correct.
Yeah, I don't want to make that trade. I want to trade my life for money and then live on for like 2 days out of the week.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, what can I do now that's going to be more appealing to me that I can stretch and feed myself with day in and day out, while still doing the shit that I love? I think that's there is a cultural shift there that's pretty cool to see. So let's dive into you. Both you and Michael, maybe it was just you, graduated with honors from Stanford. Is that correct?
Yeah, honors and distinction, meaning that I was good at taking tests and did like an honors thesis. Yeah, a computer science guy by background.
That's badass. And having been an ASU dropout, I just have mad respect for
You're a professional athlete, so you're crushing the athletic world. I was like literally pulling all-nighters in the dorm room, coding operating systems and network switches in C and C++. So
did you always, coming from that background, obviously there's the emphasis on statistics and like, is it provable and the scientific method? When did you feel like this drive towards human performance and like being the best possible version of yourself? Because that's something that drives you now. It's not just on the individual level, but like how do we increase and optimize a human in a job setting where that then changes the whole fucking workflow and actually changes the scope of the business, right? So like you're thinking about this on multiple levels, but where did that itch first come from?
It started off very rational and competitive. So I was always good at taking tests. Like I was very good at taking multiple choice tests. So I think a random factoid was that I scored the highest SAT score in the country as an 8th grader.
Dang.
So I got like a 1590 out of 1600. And it was like, I won some award. And I think I think they like Pepperdine University was going to give me like a scholarship to start college as a ninth grader. And my parents were like, nah, like that doesn't make sense. So when I got interested in biohacking human performance was really being in Silicon Valley and realizing that there was a power law of outcome and economic success being the number one player versus number two. For example, right? If you're Uber, you're literally like a 10 times bigger company and you create 10 times more value for your employees and your investors than Lyft. I mean, if you're number one social network like a Facebook versus like a MySpace is like dead. Mm-hmm. So I think with technology, you get these power law distributions of value. So, but then you like, I just had like friends working at these companies and you just realize that like the amount of smartness and intelligence or savviness is not that different. It's like one more insight or one little extra push and one little feature that pushed it over to be number one. So the incremental amount of work to be number one or number two, and just like in the athletic world, right? Like when you win a fight, it's like, you got, timing, luck, you got to choke. That like
split second faster or
It's like one of those things where it's like the difference of skill and dedication is so slim, but the outcome is so fucking different. Like you're the champion, you're a loser. So that was my mindset back in, so like I started a company right out of school, sold that company to Groupon, so I had a small exit, right before I turned 24, had resources and time to start exploring. And I was really focused on this notion that, hey, I just need to be a little bit better than everyone else and I can be a billionaire. So how do I, and I literally had friends are founding some of the biggest companies and are billionaires. So I'm like, okay, this is possible. Like kind of the Stanford American dream, Silicon Valley dream era. This was like early 2010s. So I was like, okay, like, I think in the modern landscape, I think you would probably crushed, the world when like we were competing on like who could like provide the most in terms of like food and family and being a warrior. But I saw in the modern context, it was like an economic war, right? Not to say that like, I think you're super smart, but like, I think primarily like, I think like the dominant competition set, one of the forms is like, how do you build a better business than other people? So to me, it's like, okay, like just like you compete in sport, how do you find advantages, techniques, training to sharpen your body and mind for athletic competition? What is a parallel analog to sharpen your mind for an economic battle? So that got me down that rabbit hole of nootropics. And I think that journey of just like looking at the RCTs and the animal data and the human data on like Russian Alzheimer drugs like Nupep, the racetam, there's all these things I was ordering.
I remember deep diving the racetam family and playing around, my own little guinea pig.
And I was just like, and I think at the time, I'm not sure, I haven't been, but I was like buying Chinese or Russian research chemicals from like Alibaba, right? Just like importing like bags of powder and then getting like the micrograms drug scales and mixing my own powders. So that was me. I was just like experimenting with stuff, seeing if it felt subjectively anything or could I eke out a little bit more performance, a little bit more endurance, a little bit more resilience. But I think through that journey of being like very self-focused, I just ran into and met just like really, I think that you either come into this world from like wanting to be the best, probably like from your perspective being like a high performance athlete, or being very, very sick, right? Like some of the most interesting folks I've experimented with alternate methodologies in healing or performance have come from just like literally the Western medical system failing them.
Yeah, Mark Sisson, a lot of people that I look up to in the keto space and ancestral living. Rob Wolf, they started raw vegans and it's, there's a few people on the planet maybe that can do that long term, but like they really were destroyed and came in from like just being annihilated health-wise to like really start to gain what is going to work for me, and figure that out.
Yeah, exactly. So I think like meeting like just good people that were just all searching for truth, all searching for a better methodology to live, I think just really opened the aperture of, hey, like this human performance just for myself is, I think having some self-motivated goals is fine, but I think there's like a much larger, interesting purpose around just like figuring out like how to live a well-lived life in which like being healthy, being sharp is a huge part of that. And I think going back to having that tribe of people, like how do you spend time with good people and like build projects with them and create things together? So I think what motivates me a lot now is that I have these projects that give me excuse to like come hang out with you, right? Like, and to the point, like, how do you make a living like just doing stuff that you would love to do anyways? Yeah. So in some
you got
sense,
to work out with Tim Kennedy yesterday.
Yeah, so just like get to work out with badass dudes and just learn, like, and just hang out, and it just. So in a lot of sense, I've just like molded a lot of my, you have to, not to make it overly cheeky and cute, but like you have to build out a very thoughtful infrastructure, how to keep everything moving and going, right? Like there is end of the day, a business model to make sure that like you can keep the lights going and have the resources to build and scale. We
had a dairy farmer yesterday that kept saying, she kind of sounded like Ernest from Ernest Goes to Jail. She's like, know what I mean? She kept saying, know what I mean?
Yeah.
She's like, at the end of the day, you got to eat, right? We're like, yeah, that's it. That's it.
And it's all good. We all got to eat. And I think, to me, I think the way I think about it now is that no one's going to give you the resources to allocate how you want to create something, right? Like no one said, hey, Kyle, you're the best person ever. You get to have 120 acres out here and build out like this amazing property. No, you had to like prove it, earn it, learn about it, scrap together the resources, inspire people to come support and help. And to me, it's like we are all on that journey to earn the right to allocate more and more resources, right? Because I think you have this property, you can have multiple other properties. Maybe you have 1 million people coming to, the programs. And we, like, no one's giving that to us. We need to earn the right to allocate resources and wield the influence that we have. So a lot of my focus now is, how do I earn the right every single day to have team members, have resources, have capital to allocate? That's what I think about a lot.
That's a very interesting and insightful way of looking at things, especially from a business perspective, right? So I've thought along the lines of just, what do I, Paul Chek is one of my mentors, talked about this, from a lifestyle design standpoint, how much money would you earn in an hour? Like very practical shit, and then if you made that, how many hours would you actually work? Because you could work yourself to death and make all this money and not have any time to spend it or any fucking joy in it, but like really getting clear on that. And I pride myself now that I'm paid to learn. Like I'm paid to learn and implement, not just regurgitate a bunch of fucking facts, but actually embody the things that I'm trying on and regurgitate that from my own personal experience, and to continue to have great podcasts with excellent people that gets me to travel and gets me to meet more experts and more people that I want to be around.
Yep.
So that's cool, because you can think about, end results and then backtrack. All right, how do I get there now? But with the models that you're using are really cool, because it's thinking outside the box in ways that most people aren't. And it's still in a way that you're working on net positives. You're working on win-win, metrics for everybody that's involved with, right? Like Daniel Schmachtenberger talks a lot about game A, win-loss metrics. That's been the competitive model of humanity for as long as we've had written history. And to shift that into game B, or whatever we want to call that, is necessary. We'd have to create win-win outcomes.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think I just realized that life is too short to try to fuck people over. Like, it's just actually stressful to like constantly pushing, and this is like, and I think this is like the philosophical side. We bring a lot of Taoism as well as I think Stoicism. I think very Eastern and Western philosophy of a Roman emperor and a Chinese court official, all like thinking about how to govern and master themselves in the world around them in a very chaotic time. I think they converge in some sense, is that like flow with the stream, right? Like there's some things that you cannot control, and you gotta just be stoic about like the absurdity around us. But there are some things that you really care and are willing to die for. And I think, to me, it's like, how do you, like, where is that tribe of people that are going to be side by side with you, fighting for a cause and a mission? So in some sense, it's not like, hey, I'm like, we're super granola hippie. Like, I think we're super ambitious, but it is finding a way where if we win, we all win together. I think just aligning value created and captured, it makes like life so much, and I think the business side of partnerships so much simpler, because it's not like, hey, I'm going to want more from you and we're going to start fighting. No, like, let's align all the energy on fighting on the outside, because it's so fucking hard to make anything new anyways. Yeah. And if we're spending any energy like trying to grab from each other, there's some other team that's just much more aligned, that's not internally fighting, that's going to just eat your lunch.
Yeah, they're going to work as a team. It reminds me of Mark Gaffney, who's a Jewish Kabbalistic mystic. Awesome dude. He's been on the podcast. My favorite book of his is The Erotic and the Holy. It's on Audible. It's a lecture series of him, breaking down some of these core principles. One of the things he talks about in a different book is you have role mate, which is like typical in relationships. I go make the money, she folds the laundry and keeps the house clean and feeds the kids, whatever, that's a standard role mate. And then you transcend and include, like Ken Wilber's model of consciousness. Transcend and include to get to soulmate, right? Like that's your person. That's the person you're going to be with. And this works too outside of, marriage and shit like that. Like this works on a business model. And then from what you're speaking about now, you transition from soulmate and include to wholemate, which is where you find your team. And the team is one that has a shared vision of the horizon. When you guys look out into the world, you see the same picture and you have the same method of how you're going to go after it. And that's really important.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that part is actually very important to me because I think that when we get more and more busy, we have more responsibility. I think sharing projects is actually so important to have that real deep relationship. Because I think that some people sometimes like, how do you make friends? It's like, I don't think a lot of busy people have time just for like friends that don't actually share overlapping interests in projects.
Mm-hmm.
So I think my hack around that is like, hey, let's just find low-hanging projects like work on together. So there's actually something that we are shared building to like have a baseline of a relationship. Otherwise, it's just like hard to be like, hey, like, I don't know, maybe I'll, you do like a once a quarter call. I don't know. Like, I like to just like round up, like we're brothers or like, hey, like we'll be friendly, but it's just like hard to keep in that in between.
Yeah. You're finding brothers in arms, right?
Yeah.
Who am I going to be on the front lines with, where we can go through something challenging together, create something together, give birth to something together.
Yeah.
Right. That's an important thing.
Yeah.
No doubt.
100%.
So where did you, when you first, you got into the nootropics game, I did the exact same thing somewhere towards the end of my fight career. I was hearing a lot about it, listening to Tim Ferriss's podcast with Dr. Dominic D'Agostino, some of our mutual friends, getting into ketosis, Peter Attia, guys like that. And really started just experimenting with different things. I'd had a decent amount of experience with plant medicine, but didn't have a whole lot with nootropics. I loved Alpha Brain, and so obviously that brought me to Aubrey and On It. But that was just one little piece of the pie, right? Like let me tinker with the neurochemistry, and you talk about biohacking, and I think it can be an overused kind of silly word, and it can be something that returns you to basics that actually matter. Like you have a Juve light, I have one, it's fucking awesome, and I'm outside in the sun every fucking day. I'm not going to use that in place of the sun, So talk a little bit about some of the things that kept you into the human performance model that wanted you to drive you further into different aspects of it.
Yeah. So I think it sounds like just very analogous parallel journeys. So I think nootropics was really just like the test bed, and there was just like this whole aperture of getting really into intermittent fasting. So around, I think this was like on 2015 era, Walter Longo out of USC had a pretty seminal paper around fasting for longevity, and again just very self-oriented at the time. Yeah, I want to live longer. Why not? And we started off actually pretty hardcore. And I think there was not a lot of fasting literature back, 8 years ago. So me and a couple of buddies at HVMN, we just did 72-hour fasts, like just off the gun.
Water only?
Yeah.
That's cool. Yeah. Well,
so we're just like, we didn't know it. Like there was like OMAD and 1 meal a day or like whatever. We're just like, all right, like we kind of need to do long. And I think this was like based on like the equivalent of like a mouse studies that he was doing. So it was like pretty long for humans. So we do Sunday night, and then we would break fast together at Wednesday morning, and we just started doing that. Long story short, like a lot of our friends in San Francisco and the Bay Area and Silicon Valley wanted to join us to do this fast. So we ended up actually running one of the largest, I think the largest intermittent fasting group in Silicon Valley. I think at the peak we had like 80,000 people in like a Slack and Facebook group, and people were just like talking about like their fasting, and people were hosting their own breakfasts in New York and other cities. And I think subjectively it was a great just mental discipline to realize that. I think for folks that hadn't heard of fasting, I thought you would just die if you didn't eat for like a day. Like I was like just like inculcated. I think when I was growing up, like don't skip meals, it's bad for you. Like
skin and bones.
I mean, I guess back in like I guess if you're growing up in communist China, like my parents were literally starving, and it's like we actually have food now. Like don't skip meals. So I was like very much back in that, like don't waste like a grain of rice. So realizing that hey. Our mind and body are actually quite resilient. And actually, as they were getting better at keto adapted and actually getting into ketosis, feeling actually very sharp and clear on it, it just really kind of unlocked, hey, why is this working? How do I accelerate it? How do I hack this or improve this process of fasting? And that got me down that pathway of ketogenic diets and keto. And then around a similar time, around 2016, there was a seminal paper published out of an Oxford research group showing that exogenous ketones, ketone esters, could enhance athletic endurance performance in cyclists. And I happened to be going to Europe, and I just stopped by the research group out in Oxford and realized that, hey, this technology was kind of just sitting and languishing on the lab bench. It actually originated from a 2003 DARPA program called Metabolic Dominance. So there's some military funding way back in the day. It was taking such a long time to bring up to scale. It's super expensive to manufacture. The classification as a food or a supplement or as a research chemical was still hazy. And I realized that, my skill set as an entrepreneur, as an engineer, maybe we could partner together to really scale what I thought was like a very interesting technology into an actual usable consumer product, right? Like this was like a research chemical on the lab bench when I saw it, like literally like Oxford chemical engineers were making this by hand from crude oil petroleum product.
What was the cost of it then? You mentioned that on Calendar.
Yeah, it was like $2,500, $25,000 a dose. I mean, just like super expensive because it was, again, like most organic molecules, right? Like most organic molecules in like cosmetics and food are actually derived from crude oil, just purified processed crude oil, because crude oil is just decomposed dinosaur and plant matter. So it's the same carbon length chains. You just need to replace the hydrogens and the oxygens and the nitrogens around to form like the molecule that you actually want. So that got me down the journey around, okay, if fasting is an interesting intervention and if the pathway of ketosis drives a number of the benefits of fasting, could you short circuit the hard work, the effort required to do caloric deprivation or carbohydrate deprivation to get into ketosis? Can you short circuit with a ketone beverage? And long story short, working with athletes, receiving 2 multi-million-dollar military contracts through Special Operations Command, the data is proving out that yes, you can get a lot of the benefits of fasting through a ketone beverage, and in some instances improve the physiology in a way that could not be normally achieved.
Yeah, I mean, you can't get it another way. That's something that, there's I read The Complete Guide to Fasting by Dr. Jason Fung.
Yep.
And one of the takeaways from that book is that almost all forms of fasting, if you're doing them correctly, are going to work.
Yeah.
If you're doing 16-8, fasting for 16-8, eating for 8 hours, if you do a 24-hour fast once a week, if you do just water for 3 or 4 days, right? Even Walter Longo's Prolong, which I'm not a huge fan of, but the fasting mimicking diet I am a fan of. So we'll make like 1,000 calorie ketogenic shake where it's nutritionally at 80% fat, 10% carbs, 10% protein, and we'll run that for 5 days. And like you see benefits for 6 to fucking 12 months just from doing that for 5 days. It's pretty gnarly.
Yeah.
That you can have some low hanging fruit like that. That's impressive. It's impressive to see that you guys have really taken something that I've been fascinated with. And not only have you been at the forefront of the research and really diving into, does this work? Who you guys are working with says a lot. Like you're working with some of the best operators on the fucking planet to see if this works in the most real situation. That's something I loved about fighting. Probably the main thing I missed was when I stopped was that there was no greater test. Like if how does this work on my body? Let me try that, when I hit the gym. It's like, cool. Let me try that when I'm sparring. Like does it actually influence when I spar? Does it actually influence when I have somebody, not in a life or death situation, but when the stakes are high,
yeah,
right? And they're at the highest stakes.
And this is, I think, part of like my transformation going from being much more open-minded towards like more like spiritual practices, because I feel like a lot of the academics, and that was kind of my orientation, and we published, been a co-author of a number of peer-reviewed papers within, top metabolism papers. There's a difference from like a professor telling you how metabolism works and how high performance works versus like, hey, you fought in a cage with like, with like elite athletes, or like you've been deployed downrange. And I think through those conversations and like those N=1 case studies where, like what is a randomized controlled study? Like if it's like 10 average Americans who in this day and age are basically overweight, diabetic, and pre-diabetic, and using that as a sample test bed, and we're talking about like elite athletes and operators as the test bed that we actually care about, how translatable are those protocols and metrics. So I think realizing that there's a limitation of what science can do. And I don't think it's because like the scientists are dumb or they just like do not have like the resources or the funding or the access to the right people to actually test these things in like the specific context that I think the high performance side cares about. I think just started opening up the aperture that there are boxes where science really helps solve questions, where engineering solves questions. And there's other modalities that can answer like broader types of questions, or like these N=1 like anecdotal stories, which I used to overly dismiss. I'm just much more open-minded to learning and like listening and just like getting a sense of, which I think is like a very genuine, real experience, and like achieving like metrics that are not seeable before, right? Like Lance Armstrong doing like 500 watts on a bike for like hours at a time, like. If we'd all done like a Peloton class, I just, like doing 200, 300 is like a sprint for like a normal person. He's like doubling a sprint for like 30, 40, 50 minutes. Like you can't run a randomized trial on like a normal average person and then translate it to like a Lance Armstrong.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, but it does kind of go back, right? If you're tinkering with the best in the world, some of that stuff does trickle down, right? And I think that's one of the cooler things that I've drawn to, fighting, it was all about performance. And then as I retired, it almost immediately switched over to longevity, healing, cognitive dysfunction, TBI, that kind of stuff. And plant medicines were great for that. But listening to Ferris, 2014, he had Dominic D'Agostino on, Peter Attia, he had Jim Fadiman, who wrote the Psychedelic Explorer's Guide and really, broke down microdosing before it became a thing in Silicon Valley.
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly the point where I think now, like the biohackers now, I've seen that resurgence of that term. Where like I think it was cool and then it was like not cool because it was like all these like nerds like geeking out, like they're not even like they don't even look that fit, like they're just idiots. And now I feel like it's coming back because like plant medicine, psychedelics are like literally the most popular research topic in academia now because of just the data that it works in ways that like PTSD, there is no classic therapeutic that works for that. But there's a lot of success stories and anecdotes. And I think that is causing researchers to realize, hey, there is real results here. We need to update our language of science and the aperture of science to be able to account for drugs that or molecules that might be scheduled or research chemicals. So I think to your point, like it is like taking like the interesting observations in nature in situ and how do we actually then prove it out in a more randomized, controlled, in a reproducible way. So I think that's where it's like, okay, and I think that's a little bit of, I think, where I've come to myself, which is like how that you have to know the rules of science and the principles of science, but don't be so arrogant to think that, what was in a textbook defines everything that we know about human in the universe. Because that's probably what Newton thought back in the 1600s when he invented calculus and classical physics. But obviously physics has changed a lot. So like, do we think that our modern understanding of biology is like the final page in that textbook? Hell no. So I think it's like, then where do you find inspiration to update that textbook? And I think it is like folks like yourself, just being at the bleeding edges. Some of the people in the biohacking world are going to be doing some completely dumb shit and like fuck themselves up for sure. But like in that wilderness, people are going to find like very valuable paths that hopefully trickle down to the rest of us.
Yeah. Yeah, it's funny for me. I think when Dave Asprey went on Rogan's and he was talking about how he lifts once every 2 weeks, and Joe was like, "No, dude, no. There's no fucking biohack where that works, And you could tell. Like you look at Joe's body, it was over 50, and you look at Dave's, and you're like, "There's a fucking difference there, right? Don't work out once every 2 weeks."
Yeah, I'm with you. That's why like I put myself through exercise. I didn't want to be that guy. Oh, I'm gonna just talk about like some research papers and talk at you while you're just like throwing up weight. I'm just like watching, like, cool, right? Like I didn't want to be that guy, and I think just spending time with like people in the ring, right? It's like I'm never gonna be a fighter or like a professional athlete, but I want to have that empathy, that understanding, at least that personal challenge of understanding as close to mimicry of that experience, just so I have a better empathy towards people that I respect.
Yeah, and I still love having the. I don't want to get brain damage, and I'm certainly not paid to fight or anything like that. But every now and then I'll spar again, just because it's fun. So we can actually, here's the test, right? Here's the real life situation where actually have punches coming back in my face. And that takes a little bit more endurance and a little bit more finding my center than hitting a bag does, right? Like it's a different fucking experience. And I was telling you beforehand, I had a workout with Tim Kennedy. We might work out, once a quarter. He'll hit me up and be like, hey man, we're going to this gym or let's do this thing. And I'm like, yeah, it actually works with my schedule. Let's do it. And went to this new boxing gym, and it was early in the morning, so I had fasted. I had like a little bit of coffee, and I ended up having some HVMN right before I went because I was like, fuck man, if I'm gonna be fasted, let me get this. And he's big on the on the EMOMs and high intensity intervals and Tabatas, and like the warm up had me fucked. Like I burnt through all glycogen. I was fucking like, man, I can barely keep my hands up. And then the ketones kick in, and slowly but surely I get more and more endurance while I'm on the bags. And then when we were sparring, I was breathing through my fucking nose. Like it was a cakewalk at the end of the hour.
Yeah.
And it was a full fucking hour. Like anyone who works out with Tim, like there's no part of that workout where you're like, cool, now I get to rest.
Yeah.
So I was like, that was a true testament. Is that I'm not doing that, often, but then to get to see that the proof's in the pudding. All right, if I do have a big test, this shit works when it matters, and that's a big fucking deal. Yeah.
Yeah. No, I mean, Yeah, no, I was just gonna say that, like, yeah, I did work out with him yesterday, and it's like, yeah, I mean, we need more Tims in our lives, right? Like, is someone just like, hey, keeping you on that accountable for like that rest period? I think too many of us will show up to the gym just like we show up to our work and just kind of check in and check out. Like, oh, I'm tired. I'm gonna like take an extra 5 minutes and check my Twitter and post something. Versus like every minute on the minute, all right, we're doing 30 sets of this. Oh yeah, I was like, fuck, I'm gassed after just 30 rounds of this EMOM stuff. I think we all need like our inner Tims to be accountable, have the timer on, look at it, and just be like, you're fucking doing it.
Part of that is the tribe though, right? Like you're feeding off each other. I remember when I finished ASU football, it was one of the most depressed times of my life. And, I went from having 100 guys in the weight room screaming when I was coming up from a squat, right?
Yeah.
Like, fucking get up, Grizz. It was Grizzly Adams. I had this giant beard. They call me Grizz for short. And I'm like, get the fuck up, Grizz. And you're just like, good, with music just blasting in the ASU weight room.
Yep.
To now I'm at 24-hour fitness by myself. And it's like masturbation. Like, looking there it's night and day different. There's no one there. I'm fucking got headphones in. Some guy's upset because he wants to use the bench that I'm on. It's like there's just a different vibe, right?
Yeah.
So, but if you can figure out ways to surround yourself by people that inspire you, like Tim or any other situation wherever you live, like that makes such a big difference.
Yeah.
Such a big difference.
And that's like, again, it goes back to the energy in the tribe and community that like I think is like not very quantifiable by like measure the vibes in this room. And it's like, what we're gonna try to measure some like electrical magnetic fields that are emanating off of us and trying to quantify that. Like, I don't know, maybe it's something there, but
I think heart math's doing it.
right? But I think that's like the point where it's like there's something clearly there when you're experiencing for like, you have 100 of your boys cheering you on. You're gonna like fucking push that extra little bit to like get that weight up.
Yeah. So I mean, one of the things I wanted to ask you about, because there's a ton going on, and maybe there isn't updates because it moves at the speed of science. So, but one thing that drew me was, I've had on my father's side, I've lost two different people, great grandmother and my great uncle to Alzheimer's.
Yep.
And there's been a lot of look at the ketogenic diet with type 3 diabetes or some of the neurodegenerative diseases and things like that. I forget the name of the book. I should find it if I'm going to talk about this, but there was one psychologist who cured schizophrenia with a longer term nutritional ketosis diet.
Yep.
He did 2 n = 1,
yep.
right? So like this is something that's uncurable,
yep.
right? So it's like when we're looking at whether it's psychological issues or neurodegenerative diseases, there's something that is a standout, and it's non-medical, and it's some form of fasting, caloric restriction, things like that, and then ketones as well.
Yes. Our research lead, Dr. Lat Mansour, and I actually we're getting approved for a Frontiers in Psychiatry paper around applications of ketones for psychiatric disorder, actually. So this is actually something super top of mind. So I think, just to, make sure we're not like totally just not talking about ketones. So I think a lot of like the popular knowledge around ketones has been around athletic endurance. And I think the emerging, I think a lot of your applications and also the recovery side, how do you get better in performance on endurance perspective. But I think like the deeper and I think the most personally interesting applications of ketones exactly relate to neurological conditions. I think especially with Alzheimer's and this notion of it being type 3 diabetes, essentially when you look at the Alzheimer's brain in a brain scan, there's less glucose uptake, less sugar uptake in the brain. And the etiology there is that there's insulin resistance in neurons. You need more and more insulin to pass glucose into the cells of your brain cells to then fuel it. That's exactly what diabetes, type 2 diabetes, is of the body. You need more and more insulin to have the same amount of energy, sugar, in the form of sugar going to your cells. But what if you could have an alternate substrate that does not require insulin to pass energy into these cells? And that's where ketones comes in. There's a bunch of early data around like MCT oils, ketogenic diet, fasting as like early adjuncts for Alzheimer's. And there's actually an NIH study going on around exogenous ketones that has been going on for during COVID. So I need to actually follow up on that because I think that the recruitment kind of stopped. Like a lot of research studies actually stopped during COVID. But I think that is actually one of the most exciting applications, as well as TBI and concussion. So the interesting thing about a TBI concussed brain, it actually looks very similar profile as an Alzheimer's brain. Same issue. When you get an immediate acute hit to the brain, your brain starts inflaming, and to suppress inflammation, the neuron shuts down glucose uptake. So there's actually an inhibition, of energy going into your brain. So the penumbra, like the surrounding damaged tissue of neurons, so like there's going to be some dead neurons that are just dead. You cannot recover them. But there's like these damaged neurons that are recoverable, and it requires energy to heal. But there's no glucose in that brain. All those penumbra damaged tissue continue to die. So if you have an alternate substrate like ketones that cross the blood-brain barrier, act really quickly, don't require insulin to act, can you recover? So there's actually really good data out of UCLA on a rat model where they were dropping like controlled weights onto a mouse's skull.
They did some fucked up studies. Thank you. Sorry to the mice and the rats.
So, and then basically the brain energy deficit was like recovered, and like the overall activity in the brain, it was much superior on ketones, and also lactate versus control. So actually, I co-authored a paper in Frontiers of Neuroscience, actually talking about how ketones are an interesting substrate, but also lactate. We hear about lactate in the form of lactic acid, but it's actually, an alternate substrate that like fluxes really rapidly when you're doing workouts.
It's recyclable, correct?
Yes.
Yeah.
So I think a lot of like this notion of like lactic acid being bad, it's actually just fluxing in and like back and forth. So it's like it recycles very, very quickly. And lactate is actually like an interesting fuel for the brain as well. So there's a lot of like, actually like, I think Rhonda Patrick was talking a lot about how like the lactate and ketones have interesting parallels. But I think long story short is that I think the TBI concussed brain actually may have a much more related etiology as an Alzheimer's brain. And they all are in some effect caused by brain energy deficit, caused by glucose uptake issues in the brain, either through insulin or any other, something along that metabolic pathway. Can you have a rescue pathway that's separate from that pathway to refuel and re-energize the brain?
Yeah, it's big. When my son, he's 8 and he's going to be 8 in a couple of months. When he was 3, we were away my wife and I were away at a Fit for Service event. And I got a call from my mom that Bear had a really bad concussion. He was actually at the ICU at Stanford. I was like, fuck, what happened? And he was climbing my sister took him to a play place. He was climbing up on the cubby holes where you put your socks and shoes, no pads there, just concrete. And he fell straight back and he got a hairline fracture. We were fucking besides ourselves. We flew home the next day. But in Tulum, I was sitting right next to Dr. Dan Engel, who wrote the Concussion Repair Manual, and Dr. Craig Conover, both have been on the podcast multiple times. And immediately they said the same thing, like full spectrum CBD. This is kind of a microdose of THC, which is neuroprotective. Ketones, if you'll have them. And, just put little MCTs on whatever he's eating, in his oatmeal or whatever like that and see, because that'll convert pretty quickly. And it's N equals 1, but in 3 days, he was 100%. He was literally 100%. And then for 6 weeks, we had to be like, hey, you can't run, we can't wrestle. Like you can't get re-injured in that time, right? That's even worse. So there's something where and of course he's young and eats healthy, but like he bounced back so quickly. And I was like, it was pretty, I felt like a gift sitting next to these people as the shit went down, because they had the resources to figure that out.
I'm glad it's happy. I mean, that's scary.
Sure. Yeah. Super scary. But yeah, I think about that, like with all of the people coming back and the piss poor job of the VA, like they're trying to figure out what to do with people who on every level, because there's hardware damage to the military operators that's undeniable, right? It's like, what's the best move for them to work on hardware? And there's a lot of software shit too, and I think that's where plant medicines come in. But at the same time, ketones could really be some form of a miracle for a lot of people that are suffering from hardware and software issues with the brain.
Or at the very least, an adjunct to apply as a part of like an overall nutritional package, right? I mean, I think we actually recently brought on Brian Ray, who served 20 years in the U.S. Army, 15 years in special operations. His last billet was actually running the Advanced Special Warfare Mountain School out in Fort Carson. So was like the subject matter expert for advanced mountain fighting for all of SOCOM. And I think I'm honored to have him work with us, but I think it just didn't even come from like a business side. I think he really saw that all his brothers in arms all took damage to the brain. Like they all have like no one really after 20 years like gets out of war unscathed, especially with TBI concussions and all that kind of impact on the body. And I think that it just really feels like it has accelerated over the last, I would say, 3-5 years, where ketones, other modalities, plant medicine, I think it will have to be just standard of care very, very shortly. Like you just can't have like some of the best and brightest of our country going through, GWAT, wanting to kill themselves all the time. I mean, it's like literally sad. Like I talk to veteran friends, and like every now and then, like, I had to like go talk down my guy because he was going to shoot himself. I was like, fuck, dude. Like,
well, I mean, you hear what they're prescribing. It's like, that's not going to help anything. Like fucking nothing. And
then they know that, so it's like they're just thrown out and like.
Yeah.
And again, I like, you don't want to denigrate like people's efforts. I think people like in the traditional system want to do well for these guys, but the results are pretty clear that like you can't keep doing the same thing and expect a different result. Yeah. Like whatever is the standard of care is not really great for people.
I'm sure you're familiar with the what is it, the metabolic theory of cancer and a lot of that stuff. Is there any research now that's going on around ketogenic diets and certain forms of cancer?
Yeah, I mean, I think our mutual friend Dom D'Agostino is probably like the most active researcher in that space. So kind of the interesting things that I would highlight with cancer and ketones are that there's actually different subtypes of ketone bodies. So there's D-beta hydroxybutyrate, which is the primary form of ketones, that actually gets converted to acetoacetate before it goes into the Krebs cycle. So you can
So it's going to enter, the whole thing will be acetoacetate? Or is there some...
DBHB converts to acetoacetate, which turns into acetyl-CoA, and then it goes into the Krebs cycle. And there's like different ratios that happen when you're doing ketogenic diet or different forms of exogenous ketones. So I think some of the subtlety or the chemical engineering side of house is that there are ketone esters that have D-beta hydroxybutyrate or butanediol or ketone diols. There's acetoacetate esters. There's like MCT oil esters. So I think the amount of technologies are increasing quite rapidly, and I still think a lot of the common language is calling them all the same thing. But there are like the Warburg theory is that many forms of cancer are very glycolytic, meaning that they cannot do respiration, meaning like the more efficient form of generating ATP is oxygen plus acetyl-CoA. You generate like 34, 36 ATP. Fermentation, or basically non-anaerobic, this is aerobic versus anaerobic metabolism. Anaerobic is you don't need oxygen. It's much less efficient. So the idea for these anaerobic cancer cells is that they go to a more primitive form of metabolism. So they're very kind of primal and like almost like turning to like single cell bacteria, and they constantly regenerate and replicate. So like that is what a cancer is, like something that's just like growing and unformed. It's like a mass in your body.
It's doing its own thing. It's at its own pace.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So for those types of cancers, there's early work showing that ketogenic diets are useful for that type of cancer, because you essentially starve out the carbohydrate, the glucose load, take as much carbohydrate out of the diet, and then fuel your healthy cells with ketones, which can only be metabolized aerobically. And then you kind of shrink and starve that cancer. But that said, there are forms of cancers that also like, for some reason, also can metabolize ketones. So like I think certain types of brain cancers have that sort of effect. So Dom would be the expert in the space on the specific types of cancers and glioblastoma and all these subtleties. But I think if there is like a anaerobic respiration type cancer, I think that a ketogenic approach could be valuable.
Cool. Where have you guys? I mean, you're looking at all sorts of shit from the performance side, and obviously, now looking at different medical aspects of where the application of ketones can go. Is there anything that goes outside of the cancer space or neurodegenerative space that you guys have some promise in that you're looking into?
Yeah, I think we were talking about this like off camera like a few months back, but I've not tried this, but I've heard just anecdotal, interesting stories around stacking ketones in plant medicine.
I can't answer that now, but I will be able to answer that next month.
Because like my understanding of like a lot of these ceremonies that you eat a pretty clean, purified diet, and you're oftentimes not able to hold a lot of food down because you're purging and whatnot. And that to me shows that like you're probably getting ketosis at some point in that a multi-day ceremony. And your brain might be relatively fatigued in terms of just deprived of fuel, but you have like a very quick bolus of energy in the form of ketones. Like the anecdote I heard was from this. I need to like go find this guy again because he was like one of the best squirrel suit jumper, like crazy dudes in the world, and he was pretty fucked up. He basically said like, hey, like this is like the highest death rate of any sport, like 20% of us die. So we're always dealing with shit. So he's experimenting all the plant medicine stuff and then doing this stuff. And like a lot of the people that do that sport are like adrenaline junkies that come from special operations. And yeah, like that death rate is like just actually legitimately super high. Like a lot of people die. And he was like telling me the story. Like he was in San Francisco at the time. I've lost touch with him. Hopefully he's still around. But I would love to like just like actually piece back like some of his experimentation to see exactly what his protocols were. But he was saying that like he was feeling like almost euphoric combining these things together.
Yeah.
So,
well, euphoria is an aspect of it when you're talking about something challenging like ayahuasca. It's certainly not the only thing you experience. It's not a fucking party, right?
Yeah.
But that makes a lot of sense. It was I was at Soltara in 2019, and they said that you can fast if you want. You're going to have it's going to change how much medicine you drink and things like that. But there is an aspect to working with that particular medicine where fasting's a benefit. And that makes sense to me, especially considering like the purifying of the body through dieta. That could be 6 weeks, it could be 6 months, or it might just be 6 days beforehand. But either way, there is some level of that. Like I'm going to strip away, and in part, that's how you pay it forward, so that your ceremony is able to the medicine's actually able to do the work that you're there for with your intention. But I'm very curious about that, and I will be guinea pigging this like mid-April.
Okay,
so
let me know. I'm actually
excited.
super curious because I think. Again, I've not tried plant medicine, but I'm very, very open-minded to it. And I think I am like tentative to be like, I don't want to just like throw it out there because I know there's like a lot of just like oral tradition and like practices around it. So like adding something that like probably wasn't there naturally, I don't want to like fuck people up. But like it would be interesting to like more study.
Yeah, no doubt. I mean, and that's the thing is, I mean, the fact that fasting is okay tells me that ketones are okay.
Yeah.
And yeah, there's a lot of old school thought, like, you don't have any oils, no refined processed food, no protein powder, even if it's good for you. You don't have any of that shit right before. And you don't even have salt. So I understand that aspect of it too. But I think, the energetics of ketones, even the ability to go without food longer if you're supplementing with exogenous ketones would be really cool because then you could actually manage that. And, like a lot of Dom's work on how ketones are a huge benefit when you're not optimizing your sleep.
Yeah.
Like, so for special operators, or if you're drinking at 9, drinking your first cup at 9 p.m. and not going to bed until 3 a.m., right? While you're drinking ayahuasca, that seems like it would really help with some of the mitigation around sleep and things like that.
Yeah, I think that you mentioned it. I think that's actually probably one of like the more interesting, another application area that we're studying is ketones in sleep. So there's been a lot of just HRV, Oura Ring, Whoop data that shows that it would do like a 10-gram dose of ketones before bed, and you'll have higher HRV data, which is interesting. And it kind of makes sense in the sense that like if you're in ketosis and you're sleeping, that is pretty protein and muscle sparing. There's some like just benefits from a metabolism perspective, so you can recover faster. So I'd love to just see some RCT data around that as well.
Yeah,
and that's why I think where
cool.
ketones are like super wild, because like, hey, we're talking about like athletic endurance. Now we're talking about TBI, concussion, and Alzheimer's, and maybe sleep. So I think that's where I think people like, why does this potentially do everything? And it's like, well, the way I think about ketones is that it really should be thought of as like a fourth macronutrient, right? So there's protein, fat, carbohydrate. These are the only things in your food label that have calories. Things like vitamin D, calcium, they are micronutrients. They don't have calories. They don't produce ATP, but they are enzymes or coenzymes that allow you to be more efficient either as building muscle or creating ATP. But the actual substrate that gets converted literally into ATP has to come from a macronutrient, protein, fat, carb. But ketones is really just like a new paintbrush color that you add to the three. So it's like you can have a very different metabolic profile when you have ketones adding like a fourth color. Like if you can only paint with red, green, blue, but now we have like this fourth additional color, can we paint something more beautiful? So that's why like it makes much more sense to me. Like, why is this so interesting for so many different applications? Well, it's actually just kind of a new like nutritional primitive. It has some of the attributes of fat in the metabolism, meaning that it's does not require insulin, does not trigger mTOR, AMPK, and it's similar to glucose because it's fast acting, and it's a preferred fuel, while not triggering insulin, right? So like you get like some of the different attributes of fat and carbs in like its own form, and like that. Likely, if you have a new letter in an alphabet or like a new number, it's like, okay, well, you can do like things that you wouldn't normally be able to do. Yeah,
what can we do? Just adding one, but you only had three, so that's a pretty significant thing to add one when you only had three to begin with. What have you seen around anything with the microbiome? I remember originally some of the stuff that had come out were that nutritional ketosis would actually shift the microbiome in a way to where it would create more GABA than glutamate. So as far as the parent neurochemicals, glutamate being excitatory and GABA being relaxing and centering, a lot of people fucking take gabapentin and different forms of that, pH GABA, whatever. But if your body was creating more of that, it seems like that would be a good way to sleep better, more effectively, and just
that's
feel
super
more
interesting.
calm.
I've been thinking about that pathway from more of like a caffeine adjunct or a caffeine replacement. Because I think I don't have that many vices, but I think just being overly caffeinated is probably like one of my biggest vices. So I've been thinking, okay, can I rotate caffeine with ketones, maybe having nicotine lozenges and just like cycle back and forth. But yeah, I mean, I think there's definitely applications in terms of just like, how do you, not be, I think that's probably one of the larger problems in our society. Everyone's always just like ripping too much coffee or energy drinks. So I think that's an interesting application. I know that in the microbiome that there's certain gut bacteria that really like short chain fatty acids that seem to be very beneficial. There's like a lot of these like butyrates that are very popular, but I don't think that anyone has studied ketones in the gut. I think a lot of the research applications have been much more functional endpoints. So that would be like a great like PhD thesis around
that'd be really
for someone.
cool.
Like I would say that I'm pretty up to speed on the literature of this space. And I would say like, I don't think anyone is actively looking at ketones and microbiome. I think that would be like a very interesting area, actually.
It'd be very cool. Yeah, if what you just mentioned with butyrate and some of the shorter carbon chain is that a lot of those first get reabsorbed into the intestines. Like the local area, if they want it, they say, oh, give me that. Yeah. Give me it back. Like the microbiome produces it, and then locally it's going to say, all right, let's do that to make our junctions a little tighter. Let's actually shore up the intestinal wall or help the microvilli, and so it gets used locally, and then it goes out systemically and is anti-inflammatory and does a number of other cool things. But it'd be cool to see, is it being used locally as well as systemically, right? Is this only affecting the brain, or is it affecting the gut brain? Yeah. How does that look? That'd be a cool thing to look at.
It's also, imagine if you can like trace it, because I think that's been, a lot of these tracer studies show exactly where this gets absorbed. So a lot of it goes into the heart and the brain, actually. But it'd be interesting if you could trace if it's like, especially from a gut microbiome perspective, like where exactly is it being uptaken in the small intestine? That would be an interesting thing to look at.
Oh yeah. Well, have they used methylene blue as a tracer? Because that'd be fucking rad. Because then you'd have the benefits of methylene blue stacked with it. That's one of my favorite stacks.
Yeah.
Little methylene blue with ketones, just fucking rocket ship fuel.
Well, usually you need like a radioactive isotope to track it, right? Because like methylene blue is a bigger molecule than the ketones themselves.
Gotcha.
So you want to actually be tracking like through like a radioactive isotope within the molecule itself to exactly track where it goes. So I think that, I mean, what do you think of methylene blue? I just remember like going to like some biohacker conferences and like meeting people with blue tongues. I'm like, you look like you ate a bunch of like candy or what?
And Dr. Ted Achikoso is hilarious because he makes the little lozenges, and he's got like all these like
with blue tongue.
He's like a blue Papa Smurf or something like that.
Yeah.
That's how you get the blue tongue. I think at the right dose, it's amazing because similar to ketones, it's a nootropic as well as a performance enhancer, right? And there's not a whole lot of things that do that. Like nicotine's amazing to tune me in, sharpen my focus. If I'm learning or if I'm podcasting, it's a must-have. But when it comes to like something that tandems both for cognitive function and endurance as well as performance enhancement, methylene blue is right up there. Yeah, right up there.
Yeah, cool. I got it. Yeah, I think I've been much more, I think nicotine, the data there is like actually quite robust. I think it's been overly demonized by vapes and tobacco smoking.
Yeah, I mean, well, the problem with vapes too is that you're inhaling oils and the lungs aren't necessarily very good at getting rid of that, right? Like even with Paul Chek, who, like I mentioned earlier, he does a lot of vaping through a volcano bag. I mean, he uses really good high-end organic tobaccos, and then we'll add some really good essential oils from Essential Oil Wizardry, where we can actually have like an extract of Bobinsana, which is a plant medicine in the Amazon. We can add in the elements of that or kava, or just to change the feel and the experience of what's going into our bodies. It's like if you're not working out or hitting the sauna, like it's very hard to excrete that. You're still going to have to get that out, right? Through breathing hard or hitting the sauna. And most people vaping just have no idea, and they're constantly clogging.
I have very little interest in that. I mean, I think the data around nicotine, around it being kind of a estrone esterase inhibitor. So there's some interesting like actual physiological data, but also just like social commentary data where like there was just much more smoking back in the day, and like that actually elevates testosterone by blocking estrogen conversion. Actually, it's like one of the side effects or applications of nicotine. And also, it's like that pathway is Parkinson preventative. So like people that were smokers had less incidences of Parkinson's.
No shit.
So like there's like kind of like interesting like sociological impact where like, I think on net like having people not smoke to cause lung cancer, all that stuff, probably net beneficial. But some of these like side effects.
Well, it's what it is, like you learn, like we see some of these documentaries like What the Health, and they're saying that, eating a fucking egg is the same as smoking a pack of cigarettes. And it's like, where are you getting this knowledge? Where are you getting this from? What you're studying actually matters, right? If all my meat studies are done on fucking McDonald's beef and factory farmed animals, it's not going to have the same outcome as like what we're doing here with regenerative agriculture. And organic tobacco, the way nature made it, is completely different. And that's one of the things that drew me to it, was the science of the application from a nootropic standpoint, but then also the fact that this was used across cultures indigenously. A lot of people thought that was the first plant medicine that spoke to the curanderos and taught them how to work with ayahuasca, right? This is the first bridge to the spirit world.
Yeah.
And in Northern and Central American indigenous cultures believe that was the bridge to the ancestors, is the way that the prayers would be carried to all the things, so that would be used, in ceremony for those purposes. But it is awesome. It's in a category where I really treat that plant and hold it with the highest regard, but it's a special one when you're using the right version of it.
Yeah, and I think like the coffee bean is like a plant medicine in some extent too. It's just like literally a friggin' bean that we grind up and turn into a soup. I mean, but we all love it, and it's like it's very, very socially acceptable. So like, I think from my approach, I just like try to understand. If I was an alien, I just drop in like, okay, this plant medicine bean is like great and legal, and 2 billion cups are consumed a day. This plant medicine thing that you smoke, getting unpopular, and this other hot soup of, a vine is straight up, potentially, illegal. Like if you're an alien dropping in, you're like, like what's the difference between this bean and that vine and that leaf? It's like, I don't know. Like what, like there's actually no technical difference from other than like a regulatory, legal, human law perspective. So I actually like exploring in that lane, because then it's like the thinking around it is constrained by human artifact, not by science or application.
Yeah.
And I think those are the most interesting places to like explore and think about.
Yeah, I can tell you're curious.
Yeah.
maybe when we have this conversation next time, you'll have jumped in.
Yeah.
Dude, it's been absolutely great having you on the podcast. We'll do it again for sure.
Yeah, always.
Absolutely love what you guys are doing at HVMN. Where can people find you? And of course, you guys are a sponsor. KKP at checkout will get you 20% off. But where can people find you if they want to connect with you online and see what you guys are doing?
Yeah. Follow me personally, Geoffrey Woo, GeoffreyWoo. Pretty active on Instagram and Twitter. And then HVMN, all of our channels are there.
Awesome. Thank you so much, brother.
Always a pleasure, man.
Hell yeah.